Hello, welcome. All right, so let me get your names down. So what we're covering today is the War for Independence. All right, and then what I want to do is mention that I may or may not have a meeting on Thursday. And if I do not, I'm either going to, depending on how I feel going through the War for Independence, either likely do a separate video and have it posted for you in lieu of a Zoom on Thursday, or go over the material today. And that is the Confederation that we tried during and just after the War for Independence, as this technically is our second government. All right. So let me get your names down. As I'm getting the names down, are there any questions or anything that I need to be aware of? And don't be bashful. All right. So from the 1760s through the 1770s, all right, we are going to become involved in a series of legislative, laws made by Parliament across the ocean, which did not actually represent us. Right? We didn't elect anyone to represent us in the House of Commons back in England. But as of 1707, they established modern Great Britain with the 13 colonies, Canada, Scotland, Northern Ireland, right? I'm not sure yet about uh, because they already had within their grasp India and Australia as well. But at any rate, we're under Great Britain, right? And in the 1760s, Parliament began passing laws, especially pertaining to taxes, that elicited a somewhat, defiant response by the colonies. So in 1763, they issued a proclamation contending that American colonists could not go west of the Appalachians. All right. And remember, the idea was is the West was your area to achieve the American dream, by way of land acquisition and becoming a cash crop farmer, for instance. And so that was curtailing Americans' economic opportunities, right? Here in 1763 with this proclamation. Then with the Sugar Act, it put a direct tax on sugar, okay, and also the customs officials were like the highway patrolmen, and they were to enforce the navigation laws, which were mercantilist in nature, whereby England would determine the allocation of resources, the allocation of economic opportunities, trade, highly regulate trade, etc. And remember, under mercantilism, the mother country makes no excuse. The crown and the nobility, they have no excuse for the contention that there are only a finite number of resources, and that they ought to have the right to determine the allocation of those finite resources. So hence monopolies were granted, right? So only certain companies, certain royal companies could trade in slaves, in sugar, in tea, etc., right? And make money off of that. Then if you were to have papers, you better carry your papers to have proper, verification that you had the right to engage in trade in that commodity. And they had strict rules whereby you were to be taxed at certain ports, certain times of the year. In some cases, you had to send your produce all the way to England itself, even if you were just selling it in the nearby Caribbean, whereby certain enumerated or specifically stated goods had to make it to England first to be taxed, then brought all the way down to the back to the Caribbean. So to some people, right, this hit their pocketbook, okay, and that's important to remember as just one of many factors of context of the surrounding situation to our rebellion. So absentee customs officials were to return to their posts. The vice admiralty courts, where you were to have your your tribunal if you were caught smuggling. That was a scary thing. It was like being sent to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. It was the idea that as opposed to having a jury of your peers, of fellow colonialists in your area to determine your fate, they wanted it in the hands of the Navy, of the British Navy. And so there was a common perception that you were not given much of a chance to have true justice and have a good defense of your cause in these vice admiralty courts. And what they're going to later do is they're going to move the vice admiralty courts from Nova Scotia and the Caribbean and off the coast into the mainland cities of like Philadelphia and Boston, and to kind of make a point, arguably, right, to punish these people for all the population to see. And so that's important to remember. Also, there was a general writ or like a warrant to stop American ships and to check their papers. And that was enlarged by a local judge here in the colonies, in the northern colonies, because English common law was messy, right? It's not just dictated by a written constitution, which there was not one. It's not just dictated by Parliament, nor by the Crown, but by a combination of Crown edicts, parliamentary legislation, and then of judicial decisions. So at any rate, this general writ was reopened at this time, and that brought about a lot of controversy as well. So now they could virtually stop any ship they like at any given time to inspect it. Okay, so yes, Mireya.
I have a question. So, when it comes to like when they like traded goods and stuff like that,
Sure.
at first were they not like at first can they just do it like however they wanted and then they started getting like taxed, or how did that work?
That's a good question.
Because I
Uh,
remember like I think English started taxing them, right? Like they
yes.
had to only be able to go there directly.
Yes. And there was a sense of newness to this, right? Because on paper, this was the way that it was supposed to have been the whole time, from the early 1600s up to the 1760s. But in reality, de facto, as it really was, it wasn't happening. Americans were engaging in virtually any trade they wished. They were getting involved in trading commodities that they wished, but on paper, that technically had been illegal. And so that leads to one of the most popular interpretations to this war. It's called the salutary neglect thesis, that we were neglected by England, but it had a healthy or salutary effect on us, that we became prosperous and semi independent because England was not enforcing these regulations. So, hence, you had
Yeah, because
people,
on the reading I was
yeah, please.
oh sorry.
No,
On the reading I was reading a lot about that like even George Washington like decided like not to like pay, or he decided to do his own thing, I guess.
yes, that's
I think it
absolutely
was,
true.
and they just weren't, yeah, they weren't following the rules and stuff like that.
That's right. And remember and that's another thing to consider as a factor here, right? Is in terms of expectations. With English common law, right, it was seen to be not only very complex, as I mentioned, with the different types of government, right, involved in writing the law, and there was not an actual written constitution, but it was meant, right, to slowly evolve through different future decisions, future laws, etc., as circumstances arise, especially when it pertains to happen to acclimate to the unique circumstances in the Americas, 3,000 miles away from England. So, so you have that component too. is as Americans began doing this, as they began illegally smuggling and trading goods that they didn't have papers for, getting involved in trades that they didn't have proper papers for, they began to expect to be able to do that, especially when it became intergenerational. So, hey, my father and even my grandfather did this. So why ought I not to have the right to do it as well? And especially if English common law is evolutionary, then those navigation acts need to be updated, right? And allow further fluidity, more chances for more people, because that's the way it's happening de facto in reality anyway, right? So why don't we change the laws to reflect that change, to reflect that kind of democratization of more and more people getting involved in the economy? So you're absolutely right, Mireya, and the textbook, right, does seem to adhere to the salutary neglect thesis. And so hence, having read that, you rightfully interpreted it, that this became an expectation amongst the colonists. And then that factor, like you mentioned, in Joseph Ellis's biography on George Washington, you get the sense, right, that George Washington felt like these hated middlemen by way of the navigation acts, um, that they were parasitical. They didn't have the best interest of the colonists in mind, that they were not making the wisest decisions as far as what markets to sell their commodities in, right? These customs houses. And so hence he complained several times and he finally said, you know what? This system is irrational and it's unfair. And that's another component to think about, is the Americans were beginning to feel as if the sudden implementation of these strict rules was not only against a century of tradition and practice, but that it was inherently, that they were inherently unfair, not allowing the same opportunities to all people, right? And so you're absolutely right. George Washington was bold enough whereby he stated, you know what, I'm tired of being virtually having my stuff confiscated by these middlemen, these British and Scottish businessmen. I'm gonna cut the middlemen out, and I'm gonna do my own business. And he didn't just do it on the sly, right? He broadcasted that in his letters, saying this is ridiculous, it's unfair, and I'm gonna trade myself as my own merchant, right? When he didn't have the papers at that time to do so, that mattered little to him. So absolutely, you have these components to think about. Then you also have to think about from the 1740s on, you had an enlightenment, predominantly in France and in Scotland. And you have these ideas percolating, and these ideas are very egalitarian. These ideas put everyone on paper, at least, in theory at least, on equal footing. That there needs to become an enlightenment, right? An opening of the eyes of man, and get away from the world before the Enlightenment, or as they would later say, before the French Revolution, where things were inequitable, imbalanced, unfair, etc., right? And very kind of oligarchic or aristocratic, a few people governing at the expense of everyone else. And so those ideas were being imbibed, taken in by the colonists, and that's another factor to think about as this is going on. And then you also have the component of the Scottish Enlightenment in particular, where they contended that the steps to tyranny are incremental. They're one step at a time. No prince, no king, no parliament is foolish enough to just issue a drastic law that greatly curtails the rights of their citizens, because they know that that will elicit a rebellion of some sort, right? So instead, what they do is they do things in little small steps, right? So in this case, right, for over 100 years, the assemblies in most of the 13 colonies had gained the traditional right to give their okay to taxes that were collected in the colonies themselves. So they grew, a bit entitled in that fashion, right? Where they said, okay, now this has become clear that this is in line with our rights, that we have the right as English colonists to give consent to taxes by way of directly electing men in the assemblies of each of the colonies who give their official consent to these, their permission to these taxes. So now Parliament says, no, we're going to decide 3,000 miles across the ocean to put some taxes on some commodities, and we're not going to bother asking the local assemblies for their permission. So according to the Scottish Enlightenment, right, you look and say, okay, these taxes are not that burdensome. They weren't very high in value. Oftentimes they were not even a pence, not even a portion of a penny per item. But to the Scottish Enlightenment thinking, right, is it doesn't matter, is that is a small incremental step of the government taking away a right and tradition and practice of the people. And if they did this small step today, what are they going to do tomorrow? What are they going to do 5 years from now? So to a lot of Americans, it wasn't so much that they were contending that these taxes were a burden, right, upon them, but that it was the principle. It was the principle that they had grown accustomed to giving permission to be taxed, and now suddenly that seems to be taken away at this time. All right, so all those things are something to think about. All right, and then moving on to the next slide. But by all means, please, as Mireya did, raise your hand and unmute yourself. I'd love to hear from you as students. So let's see here, the enumerated goods, hides, iron, timber, etc., right? Foreign cloth, sugar, indigo, coffee, wine. Now they're being taxed directly by Parliament, where we do not have anyone directly representing us. Okay, let's see here. So 8 colonial assemblies formed a petition and contended that economic injury had been done to them. Okay, I'm going off of Gordon S. Wood's book on the quote revolution. And then the Currency Act occurs, and the colonial people are no longer able to issue their own colonial paper. And there's a lot of power in that, right? Especially inflationary power to help out debtors, help out the poor voters and others, right? Who want more currency in circulation. So it devalues the shilling or the pound, so that it makes it easier for debtors to pay back their debts. And English Parliament is saying, no, you can no longer do that. Then, of course, the Stamp Act, right? The Stamp Act was directly, now we're not just talking about import and export taxes that affect the merchant class alone. Although I would say not the merchant class alone, because when they tax these goods, the prices of the goods went up. And so it hit consumers as well. But now the Stamp Act, any formal piece of paper that needs to be printed. So for all business owners, right? All lawyers, any tavern keepers, etc. Now they have to pay this tax to have their stuff printed, the Stamp Act. And so at any rate, Colonel Isaac Barr had an interesting speech back in Parliament. And you didn't have a nice, neat dichotomy, but almost one, whereby the Whig Party, WHIG, were the liberals, and they wanted England to democratize and to become more egalitarian on an evolutionary basis, right? And become more democratized. A lot of the Whigs tended to be the ones that defended us and our rights as colonists, contending, especially the civic route, civic rights, right? Government rights. That is strictly, you're looking at the Constitution, you're looking at judicial decisions, you're looking at laws, and you're stating, okay, as subjects or as citizens, they didn't use that term, they are entitled to this right and that right and that right, etc., right? And that's another thing that adds fuel to this controversy is the ambiguity concerning rights. Like I said, you don't have one definitive written constitution to make things clear. You also had an evolutionary kind of maze of decisions deciding upon the rights of colonists. So they early on they established two criteria for citizenship status. Is one was by blood through either one or both of your parents. If they are born Englishmen or Englishwoman, you are entitled to the right that following the blood of your parents to be granted the status of a citizen or a subject. And then another one was simply to be born within the realms in the place that you were born. If you're born under Great Britain's realms, you were entitled to the rights of citizenship. And they had denizenship, and denizenship is if you were a foreigner and you came in and you got a legal right by way of the king. So you had to be pretty well connected to become a denizen. And then you could become somewhat, at least temporarily, naturalized as a citizen. And so it was a messy, convoluted thing. Then you also had certain state colonial charters issued by different crowns at different times, right? So remember, Jamestown was 1607, but Massachusetts Bay Colony was 1630 under two separate kings. So at any rate, you have some of them stating in the charter, the original charter, um, the people that move into this colony are afforded the rights of Englishmen. They made it clear, but not in all of them. And in some of these original charters, they had become revoked by the crown. And so they were no longer had legal standing. So all of it just added to the messiness, right? Of, okay, what exactly are the civic rights that colonists in North America have as the equivalent of Englishmen? Okay. And so then to add to that, kind of complexity is you look back at England itself, and they had a movement for better representation back in England. There was a guy named John Wilkes, Wilkes, and he was contending that no more rotten boroughs or districts, that were not allowed to elect a single person into parliament, that was not fair, that every district in Great Britain ought to be able to elect its own reps to represent them actually, right, in parliament. And then the conservatives, who were known as the Tories, Tories, the Tories were more conservative, and some of them and their spokesmen contended that no, if you are under Great Britain, Parliament virtually represents you, that you may or may not have had the opportunity to elect someone into Parliament, but it doesn't matter. Even if you have not elected someone into Parliament, you still are being virtually represented by Parliament. Because, you go back to the medieval time period, and it wasn't by region, right? They didn't have direct representation the way we think of it today, right? Like the people in Modesto have a certain number of people. So then, therefore, they should elect a certain number of congressmen into office. That is more of a modern concept. And so a lot of it was by caste or class, right? The demographic, the category of the population that you were in. So hence, if you were a member of the bourgeoisie, someone who owned your own, the people of the city, if you owned your own business as an entrepreneur, if you were a merchant, like a middleman trader, right? If you were an artisan, a skilled worker, then if there were other bourgeois reps in parliament that happened to live outside your district, but they did the same thing as you for a living, then they virtually represented you because they were fellow uh, bourgeois people representing other bourgeois people throughout the kingdom. So the virtual versus actual representation, that was part of dialogue and debate at this time back in England itself, not just between England and the American colonies. So all this added to the messiness of all of it, right? The complexity as far as what really constituted our legal civic rights, okay, as English subjects here in North America. So, and then, like I said, you had other people who were imbibing the Enlightenment, the French and the Scottish Enlightenments. And there, they emphasized natural rights. And natural rights, right, are rights that you are entitled to by way of being a human being. And so the idea is what the civic rights, what the government gives, the government can take away. But with a natural right, the government is beholden, it is obligated in theory to give you and grant you those rights because by nature, just by being made as a human being, you are automatically entitled to those. So the natural rights argument was more radical, was more novel, but it was also in some ways, for lack of a better adjective, it was safer, right, route to take, because then that you didn't have to worry about all the judicial decisions and laws made by Parliament and try to refute each of those that didn't go in the direction you wanted them to go. That may, for instance, have suggested that virtual representation is good enough, or that assemblies were not supposed to have the power to give permission to all legislation and all taxation in their own regions. And so instead, when you argue natural rights, it's kind of a non-starter. I mean, how do you even argue against it? Just saying, hey, we as human beings are entitled to it. End of the story. End of the debate. So you have that component as well. So some Americans issued rhetoric that was founded upon natural rights philosophy, and then some stuck to civic rights. Okay? So with the Stamp Act, 9 states, as particularly Virginia, got together the assemblies and they protested it and stated that because our local assembly did not give permission to this stamp tax, we don't recognize it, and we're letting King George III know and Parliament know that in the future we will not recognize and we will not collect taxes that are implemented directly by Parliament where we are not represented. All right. And that's where Patrick Henry became famous in contending allegedly, right? Give me liberty or give me death. Kind of Scottish Enlightenment rhetoric that this is one step towards slavery, taking our rights away. Okay. And so that happens. And notice 9 states get together, their assemblies, and it won't be long from now, by the early 1770s, and the members of the assemblies and the local leaders of the communities that were protesting these taxes began to form committees of correspondence. And committees of correspondence, right? They kept a line of communication and political unification amongst the different assemblies of the different colonies, so that if something were to happen in Massachusetts, for instance, that South Carolina would immediately be made, aware of what had gone wrong in Massachusetts and could issue some type of action in union with Massachusetts. So remember, to the Tory conservatives and to King George III, this is flirting with treason, right? Us uniting, possibly in defiance of parliamentary laws. Okay, so the committees of correspondence were pretty big. And then the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty are part of the romantic image of our war for independence, whereby people literally sometimes meeting in taverns, and local militia parks, etc., would gather, or someone's home would gather together and form these grassroots organizations that were opposing these taxes. So they did everything from engaging in boycotts, whereby they would try to put pressure on all colonists. If a tax is laid on that good, then don't buy it. You better not buy it. It's your patriotic duty to make the English and Scottish merchants hurt over this new parliamentary tax and us refusing to buy that commodity that's taxed, right? And then in other cases, they engaged in more mob-like activity. They formed mobs in response to the Stamp Act in Boston in particular. They began going up and down certain well-to-do streets and pillaging the homes, especially the homes of those who were well-known British officials who were supporting these hated taxes. They tarred and feathered some tax collectors, all right, which was a humiliating and physically painful ordeal to put them under, et cetera, et cetera. All right. But notice, right, as with the with some of these laws, is the boycotts seem to have worked, and when the taxes were dropped at first, with the Stamp Act being dropped, right? So the England backed down. They issued at the same time their parliament a declaratory act that said, okay, if it's not clear before, may it be clear now. Parliament virtually represents the colonies and can directly tax them. And of course, the American colonists, many of them did not accept that law. Felt like it was too little, too late. The Townshend Acts, lead, paint, glass, tea, etc. Right? New external goods, import and export taxes. Right? Vice Admiralty courts were moved to the big cities. Remember, not only the Vice Admiralty courts, where people felt like that smuggling suspects would not receive true justice, but the soldiers, as a part of those naval courts, flooded into the cities. And so now you have this sense of anxiety that the crown is sending his own soldiers no longer on the periphery of the colonies to ostensibly protect the colonists from Native American attacks, but now moving them into the cities themselves. So what is he going to do? Is he going to devour his own children in the paternalistic rhetoric of that time period? The crown, the King George III being like their father. Now, is he going to turn his soldiers on his own people? So Sam Adams issues a circular to the colonies to implement the committees of correspondence and to keep communication between the assemblies of all the 13 colonies. And the royal governor, because remember, 9 of the 13 colonies were royal in nature. So they constituted a democratically elected assembly, but then a hand-picked, crown-picked governor, right? And the governor oftentimes appointed his own upper council, upper house of the legislature council that had to be approved by the assembly. And so very kind of Republican, even aristocratically Republican governments, mixed government, a little bit democratic, a little bit aristocratic, and a little bit monarchical with a strong, powerful, hand-picked governor. And there were exceptions. Rhode Island elected its own governor. Massachusetts elected its own governor. But they tended to be the anomaly and not the norm. Okay? So what governors began to do is they began to have a rift, especially hand-picked governors who were hand-picked oftentimes because of their loyalty to the crown, right? In the Mother England. They began giving ultimatums to their own assemblies. And here's a case of such. And so the governor issues an ultimatum to the Colonial Assembly of Massachusetts stating, drop your circular. This is treasonous for you to be able to coordinate with all the other colonies, especially in planning defiant petitions, right, against the government. And they would not back down. The assembly voted 92-17 to keep the circular and to try to unify the colonies. So this is the first step in the Colonial Assembly of Massachusetts being rejected by its own fellow governmental bodies, by the council and by the governor, and them having to go in hiding and as a separate entity, these assemblies. All right, so we mentioned the boycotts, there was mob violence. And matter of fact, that was one of the final things. Massachusetts Assembly dissolved. 2 regiments from Ireland were brought into Boston. There was so much trouble brewing in Boston area that you have quotes from George III of England contending that all he had to do was hang some of the ringleaders in Boston and the rest of this rebellion would just die out. He felt it was the epicenter of this rebellion. New York Assembly refused to give its okay to the Quartering Act or Mutiny Act, and that was allowing soldiers to come in and take what they needed from the private citizens that were living in the cities. And that was seen as an invasion of privacy, right? An invasion of their property. But nevertheless, the Townshend Acts were repealed, so we won again. But as a symbol, right? Prime Minister Lord North and Parliament declared they were dropping the taxes on all goods except for tea. I think you know where this is heading. So then you had the Boston Massacre. That began with a fist fight between a colonist and a British soldier fighting over a job in a rope making factory. The soldier returned to the ship, beaten up, enraged the other soldiers, and they began pursuing this man, this culprit. The man ran to a guy named Preston, a commander of the British troops, for his protection against his own soldiers as a colonist. And when Preston was trying to get information, a crowd surrounded them, began throwing rocks and snowballs and yelling and taunting at the British soldiers. And no one knows to this day if it was ordered or not, or if it was involuntary reaction, but the soldiers fired into the crowd and killed 5 people. And that was known as the Boston Massacre. The Gaspé ship, a British ship, tried to stop and commandeer an American ship to check for proper papers, and the Americans fired upon and sunk the British ship off of Rhode Island. So that brought about a lot more tension and press coverage to this issue. And then the Tea Act gave the English East India Company, right, a monopoly in selling tea to the colonies. And the tea was the only commodity, right, at that time that was taxed directly from Parliament without Assembly's consent. So then the local Sons of Liberty chapter on December 16th, 1773, engaged in the famous Boston Tea Party, throwing 10,000 shillings worth of tea into the bay. So then they wanted to make an example of Massachusetts. Boston Harbor was closed. The councilmen at the local town hall meetings were pretty much, devoid of their opportunity to meet and have meetings. Remember, the local assembly had already been shut down. So now technically at the local and at the state level, Massachusetts people had no formally recognized legislative body that represented them any longer. Now they're meeting in secret. Then they switched and decided for the Vice Admiralty courts to be taken overseas, which was seen as even scarier, right? In Scottish Enlightenment fashion. That there's no way, as a suspected of having smuggled, that you're going to get anything that approximates justice overseas in a naval Vice Admiralty court. And at the same time, they granted extraterritoriality to the English, whereby they could commit any crime against the state of Massachusetts, but they could only be meted out justice by their own British government, and in the case of soldiers, their own military. And the idea is they could get away with murder and just get a slap on the wrist for it. And they were no longer accountable to a colonial tribunal. And at the same time, with the Quebec Act, French Catholic Canadians were granted full citizenship rights. And American colonists felt like that was a slap to the face. And some even went the conspiracy theory route and contending that the Anglican Church was still secretly Catholic and was going to squash the liberties of the non-official Christian denominations, which constituted any Protestant church outside of the Anglican Church. So the first of two Continental Congresses forms, and they issue Enlightenment notions. They mentioned oppositional philosophers. They used Christian rhetoric, and they appealed to classical Greece and Rome in contending for the rights of the colonists. And they issued out a last-minute olive branch petition to King George III, asking him to put Parliament in line and recognize their rights as Englishmen and as human beings. George III discarded the letter. So now by this time, assemblies had to choose if they were going to fall in line with Britain or if they were going to continue to take a stand against these taxes. And most of them took a stand and were formally disbanded and now began to meet in secret in other places and continued to be the true voice of the colonial people. The same decision had to be made for members of the state militias. If they were going to stay loyal to the governor, whose authority they were technically under, or if they were going to leave the official militia in defiance of these taxes and now fighting for the assemblies instead. And many of those who contended to do such boasted that they could be ready at a minute's notice to defend the rights of the colonists. And so hence they were given the term Minutemen, as those who decided to not stay loyal to Great Britain as members of the state militias. So word got out that Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and other leaders of this rebellion were meeting in the Lexington area, and that they had a stash or cache of arms and weapons that they were putting together to eventually fight against the British colonial governors' state militias. And so they were ordered to come and arrest the leaders, to make these Minutemen stand down, and to confiscate their arms and ammunition under General Thomas Gage. On their way there, the famous Lexington Green outside of Boston, a ragtag group of Minutemen stood in front of the advancing troops and refused to leave. And again, no one knows who fired the first shot, but a shot was fired and about 13 Minutemen colonists were killed instantly. Then they dispersed. The British troops made it to Concord, where they narrowly missed some of the founding fathers who had just heard about it and gotten out just in time, but were then and then found a small cache of arms and weapons that they confiscated. And on their way back, right, they were sniped by hundreds of Minutemen. And I don't remember the number, but a significant number of British soldiers now were killed heading back to Boston. Then the Minutemen surrounded Boston and took Dorchester Heights in the middle of the night during a snowy storm and put up confiscated cannon atop the heights. One of the heights was taken by the British, but at a very bloody, deadly cost, and that was Bunker Hill. And a lot of lives were lost there, especially by the British. So then the British evacuate Boston, head back up to Nova Scotia, Canada, and then returned with 40,000 soldiers to Long Island and to New York. Now the fight was on. And boy, the English kicked our butts in New York. It did not go well in 1776 on the battlefields. Matter of fact, according to the book 1776, they had us proverbially on the ropes, but did not finish us off on at least 2 occasions where our men were cornered from the Continental Army on Manhattan Island and on Staten Island. And through the fog and delusionary tactics, we're able to get away to fight another day. Then the British decided to take Philadelphia, where our Continental Congress was residing, and they had to go in hiding. And they began a series of taking major cities. But we engaged in, as the Spanish called it, little warfare, guerrilla, right? Guerrilla warfare. And so we just waited for them to leave the cities and attack them again, attack their supply lines, hit them in small attacks, and then run and hide. So their conventional ways of fighting and conventional strategy of taking cities was not effective in winning the war anyway. Then they tried to encircle the New England colonies. But through espionage, we found out before what they were up to. And then they kind of shot themselves in the foot, metaphorically. They brought in a guy named Burgoyne. And Burgoyne was not next in line under their English patronage system. Under their patronage system of seniority and crown connections, it should not have been him. And there was a lot of resentment against Burgoyne and against the leading commander for giving it to Burgoyne. So much so that a guy named Clinton did not even join Burgoyne out of anger. And then a guy named Howe, Howe, got himself a girlfriend in Philadelphia, ensconced himself in the winter, and failed to come and meet Burgoyne as well. So Burgoyne literally was supposed to have been met with 2 armies that never came. And we knew about the plans to encircle the New England colonies around Albany, New York. So before Burgoyne could get to Albany, he was surrounded at Saratoga, Saratoga, surrendered over 10,000 soldiers. And upon the surrender at Saratoga, Louis XVI of France decided to throw in his lot with the rebellion and signed a military alliance with the rebellion. And from there on out, we wouldn't just get mercenaries like the Marquis de Lafayette, Lacombe de Rochambeau, but now we're getting thousands of French soldiers to come and help us. We had some brilliant tacticians, Nathaniel Greene in particular. The Marquis de Lafayette was allegedly very brilliant and successful in guerrilla warfare tactics. But not so much military genius, but just the mere presence of George Washington kept the men solidified during the low times. Just the prestige of his name and his physical bearing and his insane courage. On one case in the book 1776, it contends that Washington was humiliated at a place called Jamaica Pass at Brooklyn Heights battle. He was furious, his ego wounded. And one of the men tried to shoot Nathaniel Greene, one of his own right-hand men, when Nathaniel Greene told him he couldn't flee and leave the trench. Luckily, the gun misfired, nothing happened to Greene, but word got back to Washington. Washington rode in after the battle, asked where the man was, shoved the guy down to his knees, grabbed him by the queue with the hair, the ponytail, and put a pistol to his head. Nathaniel Greene begged for the guy's life, said, "It's okay, I forgive him. And no harm was done. He was just panicking." And Washington threw him to the ground and said, "Very well, but the next time there'll be no mercy," and got on his horse and rode away. So George Washington implemented discipline and put some fear. If you look at the militia mutinies in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, especially the one in New Jersey, George Washington dealt with it pretty severely. They also promised the soldiers land and salaries if they continue the fight. Now, why were they needing to induce them through the carrot and the stick, through fear of punishment and through rewards? Was it because, is it human nature that because the war was not going well and we were losing, that when the going gets tough, most people just don't have the grit to stick it through? Or to what extent did the regular people, the regular soldiers, not see this as their fight and almost need to be coerced and manipulated into fighting a battle, a fight, a war that they did not think was their own? Something to think about. So at any rate, going back to the assignment, Mireya, please.
I have a question.
Sure.
You know how you said that some people didn't see it as a war? I remember, I don't know which war, but I remember reading something about along the lines that a lot of people felt like they were fighting a war that wasn't for them. But I don't remember which one, or I remember reading
Yeah.
something about that, but I don't remember where it came from.
No, it's okay. If I had to guess, I mean, even as late as World War II, as much of a war as it seemed to have been for arguably a somewhat just cause, right, against the spreading of fascism, the Holocaust, etc., right? And I'm not even saying that that was truly our motives in fighting it, but just as it was fighting against such things. Even in that such war, you can make the argument that certain demographics like Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans, African Americans felt like this was not their war by the way they were treated during World War II. And so, of course, how much more could you make that argument with some of the other wars that were earlier than that, and Jim Crow laws were so well established, or slavery had not yet been, manumission had not been achieved yet, like the Civil War, etc. So no, Mireya, that's a good point. So in this war, absolutely. What about African Americans? Remember, Lord Dunmore of Virginia declared that all slaves will be declared free who fight for Mother England. They could be freed from their masters. You literally had a legal case of writings that we can go to of Southern well-to-do white English Americans deciding to join the rebellion simply because of Lord Dunmore's edict for the slaves. So they ironically wanted to fight the war in order to keep their slaves. What a paradox, right? In light of the rhetoric about, oh, it's for freedom and equality with all the Enlightenment rhetoric during the time. So needless to say, African Americans had reasons to join the Ethiopian Regiment, as became famously known, and some of the black fighting units that fought with England against us, and certainly wouldn't have considered this their war. So that's just one of many examples, Mireya, that supports what you said.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. I love when you guys chime in. I really do. I appreciate it. So, context. I'm going to go to that last. So, number one, the salutary neglect thesis. I try to give you evidence of the colonies virtually being left alone by dad and doing well for it, gaining rights for themselves in the assemblies. And I give you specific examples of that from Paul Johnson's book. All right. Smuggling and doing what they wished economically while dad was not paying close attention. Then suddenly at the end of the French and Indian War, the British cracked down with these decrees and taxes. So it's likened to a son or daughter who has a strict parent on paper, but the parent never is around. The father figure is never around to actually implement and enforce his strict rules. And the son or daughter becomes 18, 19 years old and doing very well for him or herself. Dad comes home and says, things are going to change. I'm going to implement these rules. And the son or daughter says, sorry, dad, too little, too late. I'm on my own and I'm doing well without you. That virtually is number one. And that's what you're going to find in the textbook as well as Alan Brinkley's interpretation to this war. And I would also say for a long time, this was the interpretation in England itself about our war for independence. That they didn't enforce their strict rules well. We did as we pleased. Then they waited too long to try to crack down, and we fought to keep a good thing going. All right. Number two is court history. Remember, court history, you're praising the winners. So this contends, right? This deals with American exceptionalism. Remember, American exceptionalism. We are exceptional. We're special. We're different. We're better than most countries. Most typical countries, right? Arguably, have been born upon greed, ambition, desire for resources, power plays, right? But not the US, court historians claim, right? The US was born upon ideas, lofty principles that makes us a special nation, a unique, exceptional nation. This is the history we got when we were kids, right? So instead of fighting for greed, for resources, to simply keep a good thing going as we were doing as we pleased already, like the salutary neglect thesis, this one contends we became enlightened. The French and Scottish Enlightenment, the religious Great Awakening, heavily revolutionized Americans' thinking, Americans' expectations, Americans' worldview, Americans' values. And once we became revolutionized in our heads, We fought for those lofty principles. So hence Court History by Bernard Bailyn. So what are some of those ideas? The idea of the social contract. Think of us going as a class on an airplane, and God forbid it crashed, but we survived, but we became marooned on an island, and we reverted back to a state of nature with no government. So it's each man and woman for him or herself. The idea was stated Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke, is that in that state of nature, that at one time that truly happened. And it was each man or woman for himself. And we lived in this anarchic freedom, state of nature, as they call it. No different from the animals. But then they said, mankind being who he is, that if we spend enough time on that island, we would begin developing factions, one group or cliquey group against another cliquey group, individuals taking away the natural rights of other people, perhaps someone coming and bullying you and saying, catch me a fish, catch me some food, or else I'm going to harm you. Falling asleep and waking up without your cell phone and some of your personal, private, possessions. So for all these reasons, right, they said in a state of nature, government is a necessary evil. Because in a state of nature, enough people will abuse their freedom that it'll begin to infringe upon the natural rights of those around them. So, but the government is to be minimalized. It's a necessary evil and nothing more. And it is to become our servant, not our master. So we decide enough people have been deprived of their natural rights on this little island. So we have a meeting and we decide to democratically elect a group, a governing group. But that governing group doesn't tell us what to do. That governing group protects our natural rights. And amongst the natural rights they mentioned in their books are life, liberty, and property. Other Enlightenment writers and philosophers are going to add to that list of what they believe to be natural rights. We're going to get to that in a minute. But sticking with this, if that governing group that we hire, that we elect, fails to do its job in protecting our rights, then it is our right, our duty to remove them and put in new people who will. Literally the right of revolution and the consent of the governed. So that was big with the French Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment wanted accountability and transparency, as did the Scottish Enlightenment, where I'm going to get to in just a moment. But going back to natural rights, you have Voltaire, freedom of expression, right? To speak your mind, to actually, on paper, defy the government and call it out for what it's doing in corrupt fashion without vindictive reprisals by the government. Diderot and Condorcet, the writers of the encyclopedia, the right for mankind to cultivate himself, to become educated, to learn whatever trade he or she wishes, and to rise as far as his or her hard work and talent allow him or her to rise. And to me, I think that's a lot of what Thomas Jefferson had in mind when he stated pursuit of happiness, was Diderot and Condorcet. And another natural right is Beccaria. And Beccaria wrote about the natural right that every human being should have, when being accused of committing a crime, when technically a suspect. So a right to represent him or herself, not to be cruelly punished, not to be tortured to extract a confession, to be able to counter-examine hostile witnesses, to challenge what they contend they saw, to be represented legally by an attorney, to be free from unwarranted searches and seizures, and to have a sense of privacy and sanctity of one's own property. So those constitute some other examples of natural rights that percolated in the French Enlightenment. All right. And of course, Adam Smith and capitalism, the right for all people to pursue their own economic self-interest. So it's a little bit more narrow than Diderot and Condorcet's pursuit of happiness. The Scottish Enlightenment contended that power cannot be concentrated too heavily into one body or one individual. That there is something inherent in human nature whereby we will, not can, but we will almost inevitably become tyrants if the people let us. That mankind cannot be trusted with too much power. So hence, right, there needs to be accountability. There need to be checks and balances, like Montesquieu said in his book called Spirit of the Laws. You need to have a written constitution that states what people can and cannot do, and what individual rights people are entitled to as natural rights and civic rights. And then the Great Awakening religiously stated that deference, knowing your place and obeying your superiors, ought to become conditional. And remember, this is a religious movement. So they contended that if your reverend, your priest, your pastor, your preacher, and your clergy no longer follow the Bible and God's values, you have a right to rebel against them. And a lot of people say that idea carried itself over to the secular realm, whereby the same logic carried over. That if King George III and Parliament began to rule unjustly, it was the right, even the responsibility of American colonists to rebel against them. And according to Balin, these ideas weren't directly read by the majority of American citizens. Just like today, right? A lot of people worked from sun up to sundown. A lot of people had nothing beyond basic education and basic literacy skills. They're not going to be able to read Rousseau's Social Contract in French. Or the French Encyclopedia. But we had a literati, we had an intelligentsia, an elite small group of colonial leaders, right, who did have the time, the leisure, the education, and the means to read these works. Some of those people are John Dickinson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. They read them and they truncated or summarized what they had read and put it in palatable form for the people to understand through simple slogans, through 30-page pamphlets, in page-and-a-half anonymous columns and newspapers, etc. And so by virtue of that, Balin says, even the average American became enlightened, had his eyes opened as far as what government and society ought to be like. And that becoming enlightened enhanced their expectations and led them to rebel. Because England at that time was not living up to those Enlightenment standards. Number 3, you see more of a selfish, ambitious side to the founding fathers like George Washington, whereby under the patronage system, he was trying to rise up the military ranks. Under the mercantilist system, he was trying to make a quick buck as a cash crop farmer. And in both cases, his ambitions were being thwarted by the British and the British system. They just wouldn't handpick him for the right positions in the military. And he even got in trouble for bad-mouthing a superior and claiming that the man was an imbecile and incapable of doing his job well. But he felt, right, that this system of patronage, whereby it was not about talent, not about merit, not about skill, but just simply about family connections and wealth as far as who got what position in the military. To Washington, right, that system was foolish, it was inefficient, and it was unfair. Likewise, his ability to sell hemp for rope, tobacco, wine, other things that were created at Mount Vernon. He could have sold them for a certain, profit percentage, profit margin in the Caribbean. But instead, his goods had to go all the way to England first, or Scotland, to be taxed, and they decided at what price and in what market they would have it sold. Infuriated him. He felt like they didn't make the wisest decisions, that they certainly didn't have his best interest at heart. And that it was overall unfair. So hence, personal grievances may have led some of our founding fathers and the average lay person joining the rebellion to do such. What if Washington had received the military positions that he coveted? What if his middlemen had not been parasitical and foolish in their decisions and how to sell his commodities? Would he even have joined the rebellion? I don't begin to know, but it's something to think about. All right. And number 4, you have evidence before the War for Independence began of frontier Western districts, especially, complaining about their elected assemblymen going over the heads of their elected assemblymen to the governors and councils, and complaining that their assemblymen didn't have their best interest at heart and were not representing them fairly. You have evidence of a burgeoning gulf between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. You have a burgeoning population that just exploded in the early to mid 1700s. People moving into the cities in great numbers, and in other cases, people moving out of the cities in great numbers. And all the social and other issues like crime, etc., representation, trade, acceptance into guilds, somewhat guilds anyway, all those factors that come with that. You even had some rebellions, like the Regulators in the Carolinas, like the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania. So you had drama within the colonies and lack of cohesion and big gulfs between the rich and the poor and class consciousness. People becoming very aware of and firstly identifying with what economic class they were in before thinking of themselves as Americans, for instance, or as British subjects. So under that context, Howard Zinn cynically sees the founding fathers as ambitious men of their own class who had its own agenda. They wanted the top positions, he says, that the British inhabited. They also grew fearful of a mass rebellion of the poor, indiscriminately turning its ugly head toward all the well-to-do, not just the British officials. And let's face it, the founding fathers were well-to-do. And so hence, Howard Zinn says, these founding fathers very shrewdly hijacked the poor's rebellion, made a scapegoat out of the British, telling them, don't hate us as your assemblymen and your well-to-do colonists, but hate the British. They're the source of all your grievances. And also, don't worry, we have your interest in mind as well. We promise you land, we promise you salaries to fight for us. And we also promise you this rhetoric through our propaganda. Consent of the government, checks and balances, government of, by, and for the people, individual human rights. We promise you a better country once we're independent. So very manipulative, self-serving, image of these founding fathers found in number 4. All right, so any questions? Anybody at all? All right. Well, you will get your points for this, okay? I thank you for coming, and I will let you know by way of an announcement if we're going to meet on Thursday or if I'm going to merely send you a video. Because I may or may not be able to meet Thursday at 1 o'clock. All right, thank you, Mireya.
Minus whenever you get a chance.
I'm sorry?
I have a question about my assignments.
Sure. Okay, what I'll do again, Melissa, is I'll go ahead and bid everyone adieu. And if you have any questions, and not just Melissa, anybody, okay? If you have any questions, stay on and I'll address you one at a time. But as for everyone else, go ahead and feel free to leave the meeting, okay? You guys have a great week if I don't see you on Thursday. Have a great day.
Right, thank you. Have a great week.
You as well. Thank you, Drea. All right.
Thank you. I have a question. I am like totally behind. I missed the 3 and 4, but I was trying to like do the most relevant first and then work backwards. But on the test, where do I get the other test for the book?
The other test for the book. Are you talking about the quizzes, or because the quizzes are the only thing that are directly tied to the book?
Oh, and those are in Canvas, right?
That's right, under quizzes.
Oh, okay. And then the tests are on there too?
The tests are under quizzes as well. That's right.
I don't have to find a place to do the test quizzes for the assignments?
I'm sorry, what was that?
I don't have to go like outside of Canvas to do the test and the quizzes?
No, not at all. Yeah, you should be able to go right to quizzes on Canvas to do the quizzes and the tests.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank
That's
you.
okay.
I just keep turning stuff in and then
Yes,
I
please.
should be caught up week.
No, sure.
Okay.
If you have to work
Okay.
backward, that's fine.
All right. Have a great day.
All
Hope
right,
Thursday.
you too.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. All right, Maricela, Narion, any questions?
Okay. Yeah, I had a couple questions like about the tests. The first one, it took me kind of long, just because so like for some of the questions, I remembered reading it, but I didn't know exactly where to go to find it to make sure like that was the answer. So what do you like? Do they mostly come from the argumentative assignments
Oh,
or?
absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah,
because I know
absolutely.
I seen that it said to go back and watch the videos as well, like the lecture videos. So I didn't know if most of them, like I didn't know where to start. I didn't know if I should watch the videos, if I should like reread my argumentative sections, or through some of them I was looking directly through the textbook as well.
Yes, no, that's a great question. I would definitely recommend first and foremost looking through your argumentative assignments.
Okay.
I mean, honest to goodness, I would say close to 90% of the questions come straight from the argumentative sections.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then for the next tests, the ones that we aren't going to have unlimited submissions on, are you going to do like a study guide of any kind? Or I know for your video on test 1 overview, how you had the actual test like written out. Are you going to do anything like that or?
I am. Yeah, I'll go over test 2 and 3. I may not do it like exactly number per number and show you every option and tell you, okay, the answer is option B.
Mhm.
I may not do it to that extent, Maricela, for 2 and 3, but I will try to give you every bit of information for you to literally ace the test for both
Okay.
test 2 and 3. Yeah.
Okay. And then are they unlimited as well, or are those ones going to be timed?
No, to be honest, they're unlimited with time, but most of the time I have test 2 and 3 only one submission.
Okay. Yeah. But it's unlimited, like for the
Oh,
submission.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
If it's up to me, as long as I have power over that, I will certainly choose to have it be of unlimited duration. Yeah.
Alrighty, sounds good. I think that is it.
All right. Well, great. I hope I helped.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello, Narayan.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, thank you.
How can I help you?
Oh no, I was just saying that thank you for the information.
Oh,
Thank you
thank
for-
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me.
Not a problem. Sorry, I was trying to tell you that I have to go back to work. So if that's okay, if I could leave now.
Of course. Of course.
Okay. Okay, thank
Right.
you
You
so
have
much.
a good day. Okay.
Okay, you as well.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.